The Industrial Revolution was possibly the single most significant event in world history. The moment when one small nation left behind its agrarian past and entered decisively on the pathway to modernity. I've come to the London Museum of Water and Steam, and I'm standing in front of one of the largest steam engines ever built. It's 2 stories high, and its job was to pump clean water into Victorian London. It's called the 90-inch because of the size of its cylinder. Charles Dickens called it a monster, and you can see why. It really is enormous. We're happy to celebrate these great machines of industrial Britain, but when we think about the workers who operated machines like this, we tend to think there is less to celebrate. The introduction of new working patterns which compelled men to work at the relentless pace of a machine like this. Families squeezed into dark, disease-ridden cities, and nothing but the workhouse for those who slipped through the net. But what if this story isn't really true? What if working people were not simply crushed in the cogs of the great industrial juggernaut? Is it possible that even the poor had something to gain from the Industrial Revolution? I've been looking at accounts of everyday life written by working people themselves. And I think that if we stop and really listen to what they're trying to tell us, we hear a version of the past that contains a few surprises.
Great joy was anticipated by my going to night school, but on the day, as the hour grew near, a trembling sensation came over me.
I went to Sunday school a good while. I got to read fairly well and write a little.
We all combined together about this trifling thing and sent him a summons and had it tried before the mayor and cost him for our wages.
I got mixed up with some of its great men and even thought of myself as somebody.
I've found more than 300 autobiographies written by working people spanning the years of the Industrial Revolution. They're almost all written by men, so they aren't going to teach us much about women's lives. Nonetheless, they give voice to the experience of those male workers during a momentous time in our history.
This is known as the autobiography of Samuel Higgins.
Some are published, but others are gems still buried in archives all over the country.
Somebody was researching the history of chimney sweeps. There is information in there.
One of my favourites was written by Norfolk man John Lincoln in 1835. It's stored at the Norfolk Record Office, where archivist Gary Tewson showed me the original manuscript.
I'll carefully open this one up.
So I must say, this is just amazing to look at. I mean, you can almost tell just by looking at the document that it's the document of a poor man. And you get the sense, opening it up, that it's written at a time when paper was a very precious commodity, because he's using absolutely every scrap of paper that's available, and there's very little spare space. He's obviously bound, or somebody in his family has bound this together with a piece of cloth, isn't it? It's a piece of cloth binding that we've got there. John Lincoln has a really fascinating life. He's born into the most terrible poverty, even by the standards of the late 18th century. He's born to a single mother. His poor mother has given birth to 10 children, and she's got just 2 living at this time, and her husband has passed away as well. So here we've got on the first page, he describes how he starts working at the age of 7 and how he's really quite badly mistreated by the wife of his master.
My master was very kind, but his wife was quite a different person and used me in a very cruel and unbecoming manner. One day I offended her when she took up what is called a reel at me in her fury. On top of my head, it went through the skull bone. The blood came in torrents. My cries brought the neighbours to the house. All cried shame on her conduct. Reported the affair to the parish officers, and I was sent by them to live at another house.
But his life really takes a turn for the better when he moves down to Woolwich on the advice of a friend in his early 20s, and he starts working at the Arsenal in Woolwich. So he's really benefiting from the fact that Britain is at war with France through the early part of the 19th century, and so they're expanding the operation at Woolwich, and this is where John Lincoln comes in and manages to find good employment at a good rate of pay. He says he enjoys his work there. The pay was very good, £1, 9 shillings and 4p a week. Well, this is well over double what he would have been earning when he left Norfolk. But there are problems as well.
My work here was casting musket balls with carbine and pistol. I soon became master of my work, and there was only one man among so many that could cast quicker than me. But I very soon found it injured my health. I lost my appetite and turned very pale, and many fresh men who had always been out of doors were worse than I, some dead. The surgeon was sent for, and gave orders every man who meant to stay in the shop to take twist tobacco. I was loath to give up my place, as the work was very light and the pay was very good.
That is part of the conflict with a lot of industrial employment. You do earn good money, but obviously it's work that comes with certain risks. I always really struggle to read John Lincoln's autobiography because the writing is so small, but his handwriting is actually quite good. I think many people think it was a really rare thing for a working man to be able to write an autobiography. And it is certainly true that many autobiographers did not receive much schooling during childhood. But there were many other ways of picking up the skills of literacy, at night schools, at Sunday schools, in reading groups, and, in John Lincoln's case, sneaking up to his master's library when he worked as a servant in a castle in Norfolk as a boy.
I frequently used to steal upstairs to a retired part of the castle where was a library. It contained a large number of small books, but all in the Old English print. My mistress made her appearance in a very pleasing tone of voice and said, "I have only to beg you would keep your hands clean, and you may take any of these small books one at a time, and read them while you're tending your fire these long nights."
These reading skills stood John Lincoln in good stead throughout his adult life, and John was by no means alone in his endeavours.
Seeing that men of education had more privileges, did less hard work and more wages, thought I it'd be well for me to be one of the same lot. Education pays no taxes, it lives rent-free, its food is abundant, it is a pleasant companion. Once possessed, it's never lost.
I've just walked into the Congress room at the Mechanics' Institute in Manchester. So this is a very large room, and there's lots of evidence of its working-class history. We've got a Workers' Unite banner on the wall. We've got pictures of prominent figures in the trade unions movement. The Mechanics' Institute movement dates back to about the 1820s, and the idea behind it was really just to provide educational facilities for working men, and it very much was men, who'd missed out on schooling in childhood. So they would offer basic classes in reading and writing, and also sometimes lessons in science or more sophisticated topics as well. Being here brings to mind one of my autobiographers, William Marcroft. William Marcroft was raised in real poverty by a single mother. He'd never spent a day in his life at school. He starts work at the age of 6, and in his teens he's working as a textile worker in Haywood, just outside Manchester. Haywood doesn't have a fine Mechanics' Institute at this point, but it does have a group of men who were meeting together and calling themselves a Mechanic Institute. In fact, he describes, they meet in a room just over Mrs. Pickup's butcher's shop.
Great joy was anticipated by my going to night school. But on the day, as the hour grew near, a trembling sensation came over me. Who would be in the school? How would they look at me greasy working patch clothes? And what would the boys say about me being so old, nearly 16 years of age, and could not work out an addition sum? Good teaching and being attentive to learn soon put me in front of many of the scholars, so that at times I was an assistant teacher. Then I was spoken of with admiration.
Marcroft's education didn't just lead to personal mobility. He became a unionist, he helped to set up cooperative stores, he helped to set up libraries. It also turned him into a leader of the working class community from which he came. I loved Danny Boyle's wonderfully evocative and exciting interpretation of British history in the Olympic opening ceremony of 2012. But the scenes depicting the Industrial Revolution were called pandemonium, a word invented by John Milton for the capital of hell, here applied to the 1800s. And to my eye, the work looked like a grind, and the workers looked far from happy. They were cogs in the collective industrial machine. I think we have always been more comfortable with the view that the Industrial Revolution was bad news for the workers themselves. And this feeling still runs deep in our national psyche. Many of our favourite Victorian poets and novelists painted the industrial times in a very dark hue. William Blake wrote evocatively about Britain's dark satanic mills. William Wordsworth spoke of the outrage done to nature by the growth of urban industry. And then there are the industrial novels of Benjamin Disraeli, Elizabeth Gaskell, and of course Charles Dickens. Our understanding of Britain's industrialisation as a terrible time for the workers goes back to the very first historian of the period, Arnold Toynbee. He coined the term Industrial Revolution in 1884, summing up what had happened to the country during this period of momentous change.
It's written from a committed political perspective.
Lawrence Goldman, Fellow and Tutor in History at St Peter's College, Oxford.
I mean, Toynbee is not just a historian. He's a man who wants to ask, how can it be that in the wealthiest society on the planet at that stage, at the end of the 19th century, there is such a disparity between those who have plenty and those who live in want. It is always, as it were, premised on trying to solve the industrial question, not just write about the history of the industrial question. And in that sense, it sets the historiography in such a way as always to be critical of the experience of industrialisation, of what it involved for working class people and their communities. Thereafter, those who come on and write about industrialisation and the experience of people during the Industrial Revolution generally take a critical stance in regard to what they see as the exploitation of workers and indeed to some extent the crushing of the spirit of workers by the machines and by the industrial system more generally.
Since then, and although there were a few dissenting voices, this collective chorus of doom is still hardwired into our understanding of this period today. But when we listen to what the workers tell us in their autobiographies, these men's spirits were far from crushed by the industrial process. They were often quick to gain advantage from industrialisation, and as individuals, they expressed their own agency in many different ways. I've come to the Lancashire Archives today to meet Alan Crosby, who's a local historian and who knows one of the autobiographers that I've been looking at very well indeed, Benjamin Shaw. Alan, have you got the actual original copy of the autobiography here?
Yes, we have 2 volumes, very small brown paper wrappers. Don't look very impressive at all, but inside it's treasure. The writing is tiny.
It's absolutely tiny. One of the things that I really loved about reading Benjamin's autobiography is so often the autobiographers are telling us a narrative about how they rose up in life, how they became a preacher or they became a unionist or they've got some story to tell. And Benjamin's autobiography really doesn't follow that narrative. It really is a kind of a record of his life. And it's warts and all. And I think he's very unusual in that he describes his wife and he describes marital difficulties with his wife. And for somebody writing about those things in the 1820s, which is really unusual.
I were doomed to poverty from the time that I was married. She had no shifty management about her, as a poor woman ought to have. She kept company with the lowest and poorest of neighbours, and hearing their tales of distress, were often imposed on to help them. And I think were often cheated at the shops in her accounts, for she were easy and honest and thought everyone so.
Benjamin was a skilled worker. He was a millwright, which meant that he would be one of the people who'd be fitting out the new cotton mills with their machinery in Preston in that period. And at this stage in the development of the cotton industry, there were no large companies producing machines. They had to be built by hand on the spot by workers such as Benjamin. So very much in demand, an important cog in the wheel of the cotton industry, as it were.
One of the stories that Benjamin Shaw tells us that I'm really struck by is about how he and his fellow workers get very cross with their employer when he tells them that they can't go out for their drinkings, by which he means tea breaks. And when the employer docks their wages, he and his other workmen just group together and take the employer to court in pursuit of the lost wages. And I think that really shows a degree of empowerment amongst these workers.
This year, the master, David Ainsworth, ordered us that we should not go to our drinkings, and at the end of the week, stopped 2 shillings off our wages for not complying with his order. We all combined together about this trifling thing and sent him a summons, and had it tried before the mayor and cost him for our wages. He, being much offended with our conduct, discharged us altogether. Some submitted and begged their work again, but I and another got work with Frank Sledden at the bottom of Bolton Court.
A place like Preston during the early Industrial Revolution was a very, very flexible and fluid society, partly because so many young people in their late teens, early 20s had come into the town from outside, just as Benjamin and Betty, his wife, had done. These people are without parental ties, they have money in their pockets, and the world, as it were, is at their disposal. They can make their own decisions, their own choices about relationships, about work, about accommodation. Everything is up for grabs, really, in a place like this. This used to be the most prestigious street in the town.
Oh, really? Alan took me to find the street where Benjamin Shaw lived during Preston's cotton-producing heyday.
Right, well, this is Church Street. In the 1790s, cotton came to Preston, and this was the area where the first major cotton mills were built. Preston's characteristic building material is red brick, mostly two-storey, and typically, of course, in a town like Preston there's a lot of terraced housing, but in the area we're in, it would not have been long straight terraces. It was 3 or 4 cottages just shoved in wherever there was a bit of space to put them. It had the makings of the classic northwest England industrial slum, but when this was Benjamin's world, all of this was new. These cottages were just being built. There were still plenty of garden spaces, so it was perhaps not quite as shabby as it now looks.
Then spindle and fly frames came into use in this town. They began at Horrocks and factories increased fast. The last year, spinning by steam on the mules or spinning wheels likewise began. The Throssell spinning frame was much improved about this time, and the old factory at Spittles Moss was built.
We always have this image of terribly dense, overcramped housing, and it's a really interesting reminder, isn't it, that people would have come from rural slums, in effect, to a new and modern house that marked an improvement on anything they'd known before. They didn't have clean water, but they'd never had clean water anyway. There's no novelty in that.
I mean, people who came to a town like this were very often living in appalling circumstances in the countryside. We have images of happy peasants in white smocks, and it's nothing like that at all. And certainly in rural Lancashire, a lot of the housing for the agricultural labourers was built of mud and pebbles. And then to come here with a brick-built house, close to shops, very important changes in people's lives.
There runs through the responses to industrialisation, all the way through into the 20th century, a kind of unspoken concept of a kind of merry England.
Lawrence Goldman from Oxford University again.
Which was rural and pastoral, a kind of prelapsarian world of harmony and almost utopia, which has been disrupted by industrialisation and social change that goes with it. The reference point, always the reference point in any great social change, is the world we have lost. What is it that has changed? It's not just a kind of objective judgment on where we were and what we've moved to. It's a kind of an ideological approach which says the past was better. The past gave us certain things that we have lost in the present.
I'm on the trail of another one of our autobiographers, Emmanuel Lovekin, and I've come to a disused Methodist chapel in Rockwoodine Wood, which is a village just outside Telford. It's still an imposing building, but it's obviously seen better days as it's not in use at the moment. But it played an important role in Emmanuel's life. Like many of our autobiographers, Emmanuel didn't get any proper schooling during his childhood, and it was at the Sunday school attached to this church that Emmanuel acquired the literacy skills that he was so desperate to have.
When I was about 13, I began to feel very strongly the desires to read. I went to Sunday school a good while, learned a little knowledge and truth. Still, by perseverance, I got to read fairly well and write a little, and somehow I was looked up to as something alien to the common class of young men.
And because he is the man with a little bit of education, it's him that all his neighbours look to in order to advocate their cause.
There was sharp and strong agitation going on with the Corn Law League and a sect called the Chartists. I was very favourable to the latter and was selected secretary to the local club. I got mixed up with some of its great men and even thought of myself as somebody.
I'm here with Stephen Roberts, who's an expert on the history of Chartism. Could you start, perhaps, Stephen, by telling us a little bit more about who the Chartists were?
Well, I think Chartism can be well described as the British equivalent of the civil rights movement. It was a campaign for a say in lawmaking by working people in the second quarter of the 19th century that conscripted the support of millions of working people.
So there seems to be this connection between the Sunday schools on the one hand and the Chartists.
What the Sunday schools provided was access to books, which were often difficult for working men to find. Inevitably, they start to read literature which evokes in them a desire for political freedom. So they might read some Milton, or they might have access to Paradise Lost.
I think that's really interesting because the Sunday schools were not designed in order to liberate working people. And we find working people picking up skills of literacy wherever they could and then putting them to very different independent uses, which were often quite alien to the ideas and the ideology of the people who'd educated them in the first place.
I felt very earnest in the work I had to do, which was not very small, meeting almost every night. And now and then we had very large gatherings. We had one on the Wrekin when over 30,000 were there.
Well, Emma, we're now on the Wrekin, and the Wrekin is one of the most imposing and majestic physical features in Shropshire. A very large hill, and since I've got you here, I'm going to tell you the story of the great meeting the Chartists held in May 1842. What happened was that the Chartists, tens of thousands of them, streamed up this hill to hear a number of speakers, men like John Mason, who delivered a speech of real style and panache. And Mason begins by declaring, "What crime is so great as that which robs a man of his rights as a member of society?" And he then makes a powerful argument as to why working men should have a say in lawmaking.
You, who produce every fraction of wealth or property possessed by the middle and higher classes. You, but for your skills and labour, not a rood of land could be cultivated, drained or fenced. Not a ship could be built to guard our shores. Not an ounce of mineral be brought to the surface of the earth, and this done at a great sacrifice of human life.
So I love the fact that we've followed this path of Emmanuel Lovekin. We know he's born in this area, desperately poor. His father's an alcoholic, has very little money at home, no education. He manages to get a little bit of schooling at the Methodist Sunday school, and here he is now. He's mobilised the people of Rockwoodine Wood, and he's organised a procession of workers from Rockwoodine Wood up to the Wrekin. I mean, it's work like that that made the Chartists powerful.
There is no question at all. It was behind-the-scenes work of local activists and organisers like Lovekin. That was the lifeblood of Chartism. These local men were extremely important.
And I love the fact that we can go from one man, Emmanuel Lovekin, and then we can be standing here on the Wrekin and we're talking about a massive gathering of Chartists that had an influence on the course of history, and that we can go from the one individual to the large historical picture is really completely fascinating. In 1963, the historian E.P. Thompson's groundbreaking study, The Making of the English Working Class, was published to great acclaim. It represented a sea change in the way that historians depicted the lives of the working class during the Industrial Revolution. This was the beginning of a new strand of social history, acknowledging the experiences of the working poor for the very first time.
It's not quite true to say that everything was about kings and queens and war and diplomacy, but there is some truth in that.
Rowan McWilliam, Professor of Modern British History at Anglia Ruskin University.
And certainly I think there was an assumption before the 1960s that the history of the working class couldn't actually be written, and it couldn't be written because the sources weren't available. And even if the sources were available, ultimately the working class were not important. And I think the difference that the Making of the English Working Class by E.P. Thompson made was it showed that that was not true, that working class people had a history, and you could find sources that could tell that history.
Yeah, but it's much more than just showing us the history of the working class. He's got a really powerful interpretation about working class people's experiences of the Industrial Revolution, but it's a fairly pessimistic interpretation as well, would you say, Rowan?
Oh, undoubtedly so. I think for us the agenda now is we take what Thompson did but go further to think about the ways in which workers can be creative as well as downtrodden.
Yeah. And I think in some ways our task has been made easier since the time that E.P. Thompson was working in the 1960s. He was aware of working class autobiographies but didn't really exploit them very fully. And since then it's become apparent that there are hundreds of working class autobiographies out there and that they contain a wealth of information, and the great virtue of them is they provide a perspective of the people that we're interested in.
This is a moment when we can create a more rounded interpretation of popular experience, and this is why I think it's a very exciting moment in social history.
I've come to visit a village called Oxborough in Norfolk. This is a village where John Lincoln spent much of his younger life, and it's also where he comes back to after his work at the Woolwich Arsenal has closed down and he's out of work. He comes back to this part of Norfolk because this is where he's got settlement, which means the parish will provide a little bit of money. Life here must have formed a real contrast to the life that he was used to in Woolwich. Even today, this is a very quiet village, and as far as the eye can see, it's mostly just fields, trees, with cottages dotted here and there. John certainly found it difficult to make ends meet when he came back to Norfolk. There were more labourers than there were jobs, and he and his family are constantly struggling to keep the wolf from the door. But although John was poor when he came back to Oxborough, he was still a man who'd had the experience of earning good wages and of being a skilled workman, and he brings some of that cultural capital, if you will, back to Oxborough with him. After living here for a few years, he decides that his neighbours are an ungodly lot and he wants to bring the word of the gospel to them.
I determined by the help of the Almighty God to endeavour to bring the inhabitants of Oxborough under the sound of the gospel they had so long despised. I mentioned my thoughts of opening my house for preaching to a pious man who wished me to write to the Bishop of Norwich and told me that he would attend, which he constantly did. All the preaching was held at my humble cottage.
We still tend to think that the Industrial Revolution was fairly bad news for the workers themselves, and I think we certainly shouldn't glorify this period too much. Life was really hard for workers at this time. John comes back to Oxborough. He's frequently out of work and he's often very poor. Life was a real struggle. But John didn't think that his poverty ought to define him as a man. For John, his life wasn't about poverty, it was all about his becoming a minister of God himself. He had a voice in his own community, and he wrote down his ideas, and because he wrote them down, they can still be listened to today. And I think it's time that we start to take voices such as John Lincoln's much more seriously.